The Kursk collapse continues, and collapse is absolutely the right term. The Russians have now taken Suja. That was the only town of any size, roughly 4 to 5 thousand people. And they have moved beyond Suja and are approaching the border, which is I think now there are only 3 hamlets. We're talking about tiny places that are still under Ukrainian control, and those are probably going to last for another day or two. So it's basically over. It's really a mopping up operation now in Kursk, and the Ukrainians have just been fleeing, in not in good order. There's some attempts to give this a good spin by Sursky and Zelensky or whatever. No, it's been total chaos, and many, many, many of these men have died, fleeing across the fields. They're out in the open and they're just gunned down, or they get in convoys. There's one famous example happened a couple of days ago where this convoy was fleeing south. This was right after that pipeline operation. That's really where the collapse began. They fled south, but the Russians had destroyed a bridge. It was actually a bridge that the Ukrainians themselves had on which they had installed bombs. They were planning to destroy it after they passed over, so it would make it more difficult for the Russians to pursue them. But what the Russians did is they saw that these explosives had been installed on this bridge, and they hit the explosives with a drone, and then it set it off. So the bridge was destroyed, and when the Ukrainians fled, they fled in a large convoy, and they got there, the bridge was gone. And then the entire convoy was destroyed. The Russians were just waiting for them in an ambush. That's just one example of what it's been a massacre. And these again are the some of the most elite units. This was so important to Zelensky that he just put the best that he had into Kursk. He kept on pumping them in there, the most elite units and the best equipment. And it's all being wiped out right now. Again, there's very little left. It's basically all over, and in just a couple of days it will be over, and in all likelihood, almost certainly the Russians are going to continue. They've already pushed into Sumy, and they're going to follow these fleeing soldiers into Sumy. Putin, who was in the Kursk region just a couple of days ago, declared that there would have to be a buffer zone. So in other words, the Russians are planning to seize a large amount of territory in Sumy, just south of Kursk. So that's what's happening there. Now, in other parts of the line, there are a couple of areas. One is Toretsk, and the other is just south of Karakovo, not Karakovo, I'm sorry, Povrovsk, where the Ukrainians have actually directed a lot of reserves to those areas and have launched some counterattacks, and they've had some minor success. But these, so they show that at least they're not completely, it's not over. They still have the ability to fight back, but these counterattacks it's clear that they won't be able to hold them. We've seen this happen again and again. Actually, there are many times when they'll concentrate forces in one area and counterattack, and they may take back a village or they may take back a small part of a city, but then within a couple of weeks, the Russians move in and consolidate. They're just not able to hold the territory that they take, and I think we can see that. In other places, though, the Russians have continued to advance. Several places along the front. So yeah, I think that's a fairly fair description of what's happening on the battlefields now.
So we can say on Kursk, it's a total collapse, right? It's done. And so, but there aren't really many fortifications behind that. So the movement through Sumy could be quite rapid. And that's a pretty direct line towards Kiev if they want to be moving that way, right?
That's correct, right. Okay, there is the city of Sumy, which is the capital of the Sumy region, and the road continues through Sumy onto Kiev, and it's really not all that far. So that's going to create a great deal of panic, I imagine, in Kiev if the Russians take the city of Sumy, or even when they approach it. Yeah, the Kursk operation was just I've heard it described as a fool's crusade, and that's what it was. It made no sense from beginning to end. It was very poorly thought through, and I think we can see that the person who really cooked it up was Zelensky himself, who just doesn't have any understanding of military affairs. He got a brief bump, in his information war. It was a public relations success when he first did it. But even back then, I remember that even back then you had whisperings, analysts in the Western media were saying, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. There's nothing of strategic value here. And I think most importantly, there's just it's an undeveloped area. There's just no place to hide there. It's not like, again, the Donbass, so much of the Donbass where it's a highly urbanized area with lots of, mines and factories and rivers crisscrossing, or at least creeks that just create all kinds of natural barriers and fortifications. So the Donbass is much easier to defend, but there's nothing. You're out in the open, and so the losses there have been extraordinary. I think the Russians claimed that in Kursk alone, this was before the recent collapse. We're talking about like 2 weeks ago, before, when things really started to accelerate. It was before they started to accelerate. The Russians' Ministry of Defense stated that the Ukrainians had actually lost more equipment there than they did in all of the 2023 summer offensive. And they lost a lot of equipment in that. That was another disaster. And it actually came out in the Western press too. I remember a story in it may have been the Washington Post or something like that. That the Ukrainians were losing equipment at double the rate that they were losing in Kursk than they were losing in other places like the Donbass. And it's obvious why. Again, they're out in the open. And not only are they out in the open, they don't have the air defense there. So Russian planes were able to fly directly overhead. And, in the end, it's a disaster that we've seen.
Right. I think when we look back on this conflict, there are two real huge military failures that just stand out that I think we'll study and wonder, how did they make these decisions? And that's the 2023 summer offensive, and then this Kursk operation, the right. Kursk offensive pocket. I mean, in your mind, could you kind of you already did a little bit, but a quick comparison on just how damaging they are? Like, what was the outcome of both of these events? Like, do you think these two things really crippled the Ukrainian army? Like, if it wasn't for this, we might be in a really different situation, right?
Yeah, well, the 2023 offensive was launched with a great deal of fanfare and encouragement by the Western powers. The West was very heavily involved and was really pushing. I remember, there was talk of it. It was there was no surprise. Everybody knew it was going to happen. They even made something like a trailer about it. The Ukrainians did ahead of time. But there was oh yeah, we're going to have this great offensive, and we're going to drive all the way to the Sea of Azov, and it's going to lead to a total collapse of the Russian army. They're going to flee in panic, and then we're going to march on to Crimea. And you got a lot of this big talk, not just from the Ukrainians, but a lot of Western military leaders as well. These units there was months and months of preparation. The Ukrainian units were trained in the West. They were supplied with with the Leopard tanks and the Challenger tanks, and there was all talk about, again, how each of the Russians wouldn't be able to, when they saw one of these tanks coming over the hill or whatever, or coming across the field, they would just turn and flee. Everybody was told that Russian morale was very, very low. In the meantime, actually, in the months leading up to it, I think it was starting in the fall of 2022, the Russians actually worked on building at least 3 lines of fortifications. I believe in some areas they had up to 6 lines. They were very extensive. Very formidable lines of defense. So they were waiting for it. They knew it was coming, and they were completely ready. And it was in June of 2023 that the Ukrainians launched this offensive, and it was, I remember the videos and the images for the first several days, where you just see what the Russians had done is that, like, ahead of that first line of fortifications, they had actually laid out very extensive and dense minefields. And then they also, they had small units occupy certain, small fortifications, really firing points. And this is what it was called by different names, like the crumple zone or security zone or whatever. It's just this area north of that first line of fortifications. And for the truth be told, is the Ukrainians never got past that. They never even got to that first line of fortifications. There may have been one. In fact, I think there was one video of like one armored vehicle actually reaching, kind of rolling. I think it may have been disabled and just rolled up and kind of touched that first line of fortifications in or close to the little village of Rabitana, which was fought over for a long, long time. They just got stuck in that security zone, and they just suffered, terrible losses. There were the minefields were very, very effective, and they had a terrible time getting through them. And then they fought some very intensive battles. Probably the most famous of it was over a very, very small village, Rabitana, which was again in front of that first line of fortifications. And that's as far as they got. And then eventually, like when it was all over several months ago, the Russians took back all of these places, they were very, very minor gains and at extremely high costs. So yeah, it was a total disaster. What it did is it just greatly weakened. At that time, the Ukrainian army was rather formidable. They had a lot of reserves. They had a lot of equipment. And the Russians, at that time, starting in the fall of 2022, began building up their forces because they realized, this is a real war. Before it was this limited operation that hopefully was going to lead to some sort of peace agreement. But now this is a real war. They mobilized. They began, accepting volunteers. They began building up their forces. And while they're doing this, they said, okay, yeah, there wasn't really any effort, I think with maybe one minor exception around Kupiansk in the north, there weren't really any offensive operations to speak of. They just held the line. They just waited for the Ukrainians to attack, and the Ukrainians obliged. They just kind of smashed against this wall. Actually, they didn't even get to the wall, but they expended a large number of men and equipment, a large amount of equipment there in front of that first wall. And so when it was all over, in the fall of 2023, then the Russians began to go on the offensive. They began to move at Avdiivka in particular. And that was a crucial battle. Again, I think that was the fortress city very close to Donetsk city. And when they took it in February of the following year. That really changed everything. The whole front began to unravel, and we're seeing the consequences now. So that's what happened with that offensive. Now, at least after the summer 2023 offensive, they did have defensive fortifications like the Ukrainians did that they could fall back to. But in the Sumy region, as you pointed out, they really don't. So this was just idiotic. Again, I think we see Zelensky's fingerprints on it. The comedian, this guy is not a military man by any stretch of the imagination. So, not only did this operation never make sense, but clearly they didn't stop and think, well, what if we have to retreat? No preparations were made, and now they're in a terrible fix. So, the Russians are chasing them across the border, and it's pretty much open all the way to Sumy, to the city of Sumy.